So my career started as an internist. I trained in internal medicine, and then I studied endocrinology. I got my certification in boards in endocrinology and metabolism. And then I actually focused on neuroendocrinology. So I trained with Seymour Reichland, who was at one time the president of the Endocrine Society, but he was basically a neuroscientist. And he was studying the molecules of emotion, and he was very interested in the opiate receptor. This is long before, we had what we now know about neurotropic factors, etc., etc. He's now 94, and if he finds a snake in his garden, he'll dissect the snake hypothalamus, still looking for neurotropic receptor sites, etc. So that led me into this whole realm of molecules of emotion, and how the molecules that now people talk about every day, serotonin, opiates, oxytocin, dopamine, and other neurotropic factors, these happen to be immunomodulators as well. So they fine-tune the immune system. And I started to think that we shouldn't really speak of body-mind as separate things, because every thought, every emotion, every experience you have, cognitive experience or perceptual experience, and even how you interpret it, that leaves an imprint in the brain. There's no experience that doesn't have a neural correlate. And because the brain is the orchestrator of the symphony in the body, there's no experience that ultimately doesn't leave an imprint on the body. So I thought we shouldn't be speaking of body and mind as two separate things. Just like these days we say space-time, mass energy, wave particle, it's body-mind, it's one entity. Wherever a thought goes, a molecule follows, and wherever a molecule goes, it affects what's happening in your mind as well. Okay, so the best way to understand neuroplasticity is as follows. Your brain is created by your genes, 25,000 approximate genes that you get from your parents. But then it is sculpted by experience. Every experience, whether it's sensory experience, sound, touch, sight, taste, smell, or whether it's the interpretation of this experience. I'm enjoying this music, I'm not enjoying this music. Okay, so it's not only the sensory experience, but how you're interpreting it. You two people could be stuck in a traffic jam, and one gets stressed and the other is listening to Mozart, and their brain is correspondingly different at that time. And what we know now is that through contemplative practices such as self-reflection, meditation, mindfulness, mantras, chanting, intonation, you can actually sculpt the brain in different ways. Our brain, as you know, we have three aspects to our brain. This would be a handy model of the brain. This is the reptilian brain, this is the emotional brain, and this is the cortical brain. So the frontal cortex gets stimulated every time you self-reflect, or when you have intuition or insight or imagination, etc. It's all the cortex. Emotional experiences which modulate our biology. If you're experiencing love, compassion, joy, equanimity, the emotions modulate your biology in the direction of self-regulation or homeostasis. On the other hand, if you have anxiety, depression, guilt, shame, mistrust, hostility particularly, there's inflammation, and your body moves in the direction of actually inflammation, even low-grade inflammation, which affects everything that's happening in your body. The important thing to notice is there's not one factor that influences the brain, it's everything. So the most important things are sleep. Lack of delta sleep is now associated with actually one of the biggest risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. Sleep, stress management, contemplative and meditation practices, exercise, mind-body coordination, including martial arts or Tai Chi or Qigong or yoga, breathing techniques, even intonation, changing the tone of your voice. All these stimulate amongst other things, the vagus nerve. And now people have begun to understand that the vagus nerve, incidentally, which is called the vagus in Latin, the vagus nerve, but is related to the English word vagabond, because it goes everywhere and it influences your facial expression, which can be now recorded through micro expressions, through digital technology. It influences the movement of your eyes, your facial expressions. Are you happy? Are you unhappy? Your body language, your gestures, the tone of your voice, your heart rate variability, and even your microbial activity in the microbial genes, which outnumber your human genes 150 to 1. So you have 25,000 human genes, but you have 2 million to 20 million bacterial genes. They're affected. So my focus these days is how do we influence neuroplasticity to create a more joyful, energetic body, but also how does it reflect your emotions? How does that affect your physiology? So with sleep, with meditation, contemplative practices, exercise, mind-body coordination, breathing, emotional modulation, nutrition. As an internist, when people came to me in the past and said, I changed my diet and my asthma went away or my memory improved, I didn't believe them because I had no scientific basis. But now we know as soon as you put food in your body, it affects the microbial genes in your body, and epigenetically there's bidirectional traffic between the vagus nerve is bidirectional. So you can actually change what's happening in your brain by just changing your diet. If your diet is high in petroleum products, it's refined, processed, contaminated, has steroids, antibiotics, all of that affects your microbial activity, therefore your microbial genes. I think this is the most exciting frontier that through the pillars of well-being that people have traditionally talked about. I mentioned them, including what I mentioned, the most important: sleep, stress management, movement, mind-body coordination, breathing, diet, emotions, and connection to nature. When you walk barefoot on the ground or even touch a tree, negative ions come from the earth into your body, neutralize the excess free radicals, and actually even reset your circadian rhythms. So, when you take an integrated approach, I think the future of neuroscience and disease even, as you know, only 5% of disease-related gene mutations are fully penetrant. The rest are influenced by the factors I mentioned. So 5% will guarantee the disease. If you have this particular gene mutation for Alzheimer's, yes, but there are 20 or more genes in Alzheimer's, and even in many of the neurodegenerative disorders. Which one is fully penetrant? Well, less than 5% according to most experts. The rest we can modulate, and that's the exciting thing, to look at the mechanisms, the epigenetic mechanisms, inflammatory markers. And I think the next frontier will be looking at inflammatory markers that reflect inflammation in the brain as well, and how do you modulate that. It's very exciting that we can modulate and resculpt our brain, and through digital technologies. Yesterday I was with one of the biggest digital technology firms in the world. Everybody knows the name, but they're looking at facial micro expressions, heart rate variability, creating algorithms for just about everything. So in the next few years, you'll be able to actually have all your data over here with algorithms, but also interventions like photon stimulation, sound stimulation, tone stimulation, ultrasound, cranial ultrasound, deep brain stimulation, combined with the changes in microbial expression and understanding the exact mechanisms at the level of DNA methylation and all those very precise, targeted ways to measure what's happening in the brain and in the body. So I see the future as precise, personalized, predictable, preventable, but it requires your participation. It's not a passive thing. So consciousness can be defined in many ways. One is, it's the knowing element in every experience. So not only you have an experience, but you're aware that you're having an experience. Consciousness is that in which all experience occurs. Whether it's mental experience or perceptual experience, consciousness is that in which all experience occurs. It's that in which all experience is known, and actually all experience is a modified form of consciousness as sensory perception, sensations, images, feelings and thoughts. I like to use the acronym SIFT, S-I-F-T. Every experience we have is a sensation, sensory experience, or an image, or a feeling, or an emotion, or a thought. This is the totality of all the experience. This is how we experience our body, the world, or cognitive experiences. So consciousness is the ground of every experience that you can think about and even interpret. Without consciousness, no experience. We have states of consciousness which are easily understood, but science has only focused on 3 states of consciousness: waking, dreaming and sleeping, or hypnosis, or anesthesia. But in traditional cultures, contemplative cultures, there are higher states of consciousness that have certain aspects to them: intuition, insight, imagination, creativity, higher vision. But there are also states of consciousness like transcendence, or what people in spiritual traditions call cosmic consciousness, local and non-local consciousness at the same time. Or again, at the risk of being out there, I say people who have mystical or religious experience, divine consciousness, unity consciousness. These are states of consciousness that only now are being examined, because as I said, there's no experience that can't be measured these days. And technology is giving us the means to do it. When you combine heart rate variability, neural feedback, artificial intelligence, augmented reality, emotional well-being, nutrition, motor activity, sensory activity, you have a new frontier emerging in the science of consciousness. From what I've learned in the last decade or so, only 5% of disease-related gene mutations, or less than 5% of disease-related gene mutations, are fully penetrant, which means they guarantee the disease. So in Alzheimer's, for example, there are 20-30 genes that are implicated in Alzheimer's. As we grow older, they get activated, but only 3 are fully penetrant, and these people usually get Alzheimer's at a younger age. If you're getting at a later age Alzheimer's, that's usually, in many cases, preventable, modifiable through various lifestyle changes. As I see the near future for the 5% of disease-related gene mutations, not just cancer, but Alzheimer's. If you have a BRCA gene for breast cancer, that guarantees the disease. But many genes for breast cancer are not fully penetrant. So as we emerge into these new technologies like gene editing, for example, CRISPR, that will give us a deep insight into the 5% that are fully penetrant, but it will also give us insight into what activates and inactivates gene expression, and why that happens in certain genes and why that doesn't happen in certain genes. So I see the future as a combination of information technologies, technologies that are basically very driven by data, but also the interventions like ultrasound, cranial ultrasound, deep brain stimulation, VR, augmented reality, artificial intelligence, looking at the microbiome, looking at DNA methylation and all these mechanisms, so we can get a holistic picture of what's happening in the whole body as a system where the brain is the conductor, but every part of the body is part of the symphony. One of the things with being too reductionist is we look at the world out there, but we don't realize that the world out there and the brain are correlated activities. There's no world without a brain, and it's species specific. As we begin to understand the brains of other species, we will even see how interpersonal neuroscience, not amongst just humans, but engagement with other species, how our biology is so intricately woven with an interpersonal, transpersonal experience that includes the entire ecosystem of relationships. Well, our foundation is basically focused on how a whole systems biology approach can be effective in over 90% of chronic disease. I'm not talking about acute illness, which of course requires acute interventions. But once we start looking at chronic illness, then the approach, a whole systems approach, which can be validated through collaborative studies. So we have now seen that even a 1-week experience at a retreat center incorporating lifestyle changes can change your gene expression in the direction of self-regulation and homeostasis. Some genes will go up 17-fold over baseline. Genes associated with low-grade inflammation go down. The level of telomerase, the enzyme that regulates our genetic clock for aging, went up in our study, which was done in collaboration with Harvard and UCSF and Scripps and UCSD, where I have an academic position. We were able to show that your entire genetic activity changes, and it's very dramatic. You can look at precise mechanisms. So as the science advances, as we are able to measure at the level of molecular biology and even information technologies, we are able to measure how people and their experiences and their activities and in their social engagement and their emotional makeup, it modulates the whole body, because your body is ultimately an expression, and your brain, of what's happening in consciousness. I think mind and brain are complementarities. You know, there's this argument, does the brain create the mind? Is the brain doing the mind, or is the mind doing the brain? Actually, it's like they're complementarities, like space and time, or like mass and energy. They're not two separate things, and they're both expressions of a deeper consciousness, which of course brings us to what is called the hard problem of consciousness. We still don't know how an action potential going to the brain produces this experience. You know, your brain is 3 pounds, but it gives you the whole universe. I think it's an amazing convention. What I really like is that it's not, of course, the emphasis is on neuroscience, but you have artists here, you have humanitarians here, you have people from diverse disciplines. And my feeling is when you have diversity of opinion, even amongst the specialists, where you have open exchange of ideas, where you have a shared vision for therapeutics, prevention, and the future, and where you have the kinds of technologies that are emerging right now, including VR and immersive dreamscapes and augmented reality and neural feedback, we have a new revolution happening in brain science, and something very disruptive. But disruption happens if you go outside the box. You can't stay restricted only to neuroscience, and that is what you're doing. Your convention is unique in that it brings diversity of credentials, diversity of research, but also does not ignore the soft sciences and does not ignore the fact that music and social engagement and personal relationships and experience, whether it's internal experience or experience that we call the experience of the outside world, is constantly modulating and sculpting our brain. It's plastic because it's a verb, it's not a noun. So even when we talk about connectome, the connectome shifts and changes as our experiences change. So by consciously choosing our experiences, both social and environmental, and internal, we can reinvent the brain. I wish that as you reach more people and reach critical mass, your organization and this wonderful foundation and our collaboration can ultimately go to well-being, not only personal and biological well-being, but social well-being, and ultimately well-being in the world. We need a more peaceful, just, sustainable, healthier and joyful world, and understanding the brain can help us do that.